Good afternoon. I'm Lisa Lee, the Director of Alumni Relations here at Swarthmore, and I just am here to introduce our afternoon session, our first ever SWAT Talks at our last conference. You may notice a similarity in name to another organization, that would be the TED Talks, and yes, we did in fact model our session after TED Talks. So this afternoon we feature 3 speakers, each of whom will speak for 15 minutes, sharing their big ideas about some area related to entrepreneurship. Like TED Talks, the talks will follow one after the other without audience questions, and also like TED Talks, we hope that they will generate conversation that you will have in the reception afterwards when the conference is over. So first, our first SWAT Talk speaker is Alan Gershenfeld. As you can read in the program, he's the president and co-founder of Eline Media. Eline works with leading foundations, academics, and nonprofits and government agencies to harness the power of games for learning and social impact. Alan is at the forefront of this movement, using digital games and digital entertainment to change the world. Alan recently presented at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos with his brother Neil, Swarthmore class of 1981, and I think you'll hear a little bit more about that project here today. In one of the articles I found about the conference, the British newspaper The Telegraph referred to him as one of a new breed of entrepreneur, the disruptive innovator. I like that. So today he's going to talk to us about games for good, entrepreneurs, and gaming's double line. Bottom line, double bottom line.
Thank you. So, as Lisa mentioned, I'm class of 1984. 30 years ago, this was a 4-lane ancient swimming pool. We were just talking about it. It was one of the reasons why I came here, actually. I wanted to be on a swim team that wasn't that good, so I didn't have to work that hard. And that was a perfect pool for me. Built in 1992. That was right on this spot. So if you had told me 30 years ago I would be doing computer and video games for learning and social impact, I would have no clue what you were talking about. It's been a sort of crazy 30-year ride. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to actually talk about what we're doing right now. So when you think about media, film, TV, music, graphic novels, you don't think a lot about could these be used for education, whether it's Sesame Workshop, a graphic novel about the Holocaust, Bob Dylan, movies. It's kind of natural. Of course these are rich media. Of course these could be used for much more than just entertainment. But when it comes to computer and video games, most people still don't think that way. I used to run a very large game studio called Activision. I helped rebuild that company, made games that people played for billions of hours, and we were vilified by everybody in the 90s, by mothers, fathers, Republicans, Democrats, pretty much bipartisan. And this is sort of why. In general, this is the perception. Video games are a guy in the basement with vitamin B deficiency, playing Call of Duty for 30, 40 hours. That's part of the game industry, but the truth is, this is an incredible medium. I've worked in remote tribal villages in India, farming in Guatemala, Mexican border, very remote, everywhere in the world. I mean, and everybody plays games, whether it's mobile devices, console devices, computer devices, tablet devices. This is an unbelievably universal passion, gaming. Now, and gaming of all sorts, gaming physical world, digital gaming. It is about as diverse as you can imagine. Even more interesting, there's a lot of press. Jamie Bumble has a book called Reality is Broken. It's become a very popular book, just talking about the billions and billions and billions of hours, leaning forward, often in a highly collaborative environment, that people are immersed in these games. It's just hard not to ask, couldn't we be doing more with this medium? What's interesting is, in the years that I left Activision, I was there for many years, and I went really into social entrepreneurship, helped start a nonprofit that does filmmaking, teaches film in refugee camps, started some double bottom line businesses funded by foundations and venture capital outside the game space. But I was actually presenting at Davos back in 2007 when I found a nonprofit called Games for Change. There was a woman there that was one of the co-founders. I became chairman of that nonprofit. And it was fascinating to see all of the foundations, universities starting to deconstruct the medium. I mean, we had an instinct back then at Activision, those of us that kind of came from places like Swarthmore and had a social impact vibe, that there's something we could be doing here. But they started to deconstruct it. At the very core, digital games are about giving players agency. They take on roles, they can take on identities, they enter a problem space, they have to solve a problem, individually or collaboratively, using verbs, using mechanics. You have to think systemically. Games often have extensions where you can extend and mod them. When you build games, you build systems. You build complex digital systems for somebody else to use. creativity, how you think about solving problems, how you work with other people. Games keep you on this razor's edge of just enough challenge, just enough reward with copious feedback to help you get to the next level. That's good learning. That's learning science. That's the very essence of inquiry or project-based learning. So at the very core, this medium has the bones for incredible learning, behavior change, social impact. The market opportunity, this is an entrepreneurship conference, is unbelievable right now. The next 5 to 6 years in education is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to create transformation. All of these, in America, the assessments are changing. You have these new Common Core next-generation science standards that are a little bit more about higher order thinking, critical thinking, problem solving, quantitative, qualitative analysis to solve problems. You have technology showing up in the classroom, huge investment, tablets, bandwidth. But teachers haven't been trained on how to use blended learning, technology. You can disintermediate the top-down sales system. You can go right to teachers now with offerings and scale a product, much like you could in the consumer industry. In the consumer side, it's equally exciting. A game like Minecraft, which was made by one person, a guy who goes by the name of Notch, is played by 30, 40 million kids, all paying around the world. Probably the most profitable game ever created. Disintermediated the Activisions and EAs of the world, disintermediated Walmart and Best Buy, just went right to the consumer. So massive disintermediation creates huge opportunity. Everyone has devices. You know, there's such shifting dynamics. It's an unbelievable opportunity for both impact and for market opportunity. The reason why I started Eli Media with a colleague was when I became chairman of Games for Change, I was tracking literally hundreds of millions of dollars coming from government agencies, foundations, universities, social entrepreneurs, nonprofits, all reading this research, wanting to do the research, and saying, how do I harness games to further my learning goal, my health goal, my social impact goal? And I'm telling you, every type of learning, health, social impact that you could imagine. But what we weren't seeing were products and services coming out of the other end that were actually making impact at scale. They weren't replacing, and a lot of these are services, so when the grant ran out, the project got shut down, even if they had some early findings. So we're looking at it and saying, how do we help solve this problem? And my Activision experience, I mean, you could just apply some basic 101 publishing, and it would actually be my biggest comment for the presentations I saw this morning. And I think you heard it in the expert panels, which is people presented a product, and it's not just about the business model and how you make money, it's really the context that that product will live. And often it's a lot of the things around the product that situate it towards a specific market that make it successful. And you know, all fine, I can kind of deconstruct our experience in the consumer space, in the school space, in the informal learning space, and just how different they are. So I won't go into all the details of our methods and processes, but we really try to understand, once we understand the impact that somebody wants, whether it's behavioral change, whether it's a learning disposition, whether it's knowledge, whatever the impact is, we actually deconstruct the audience, the demographic, the psychographic, the channels that it will be delivered in, the context that it will be used in, and we tune the product for that, not the other way around. So we don't build a product and say, hey, the channel's broken, or schools are broken. No, your product's broken. That's our opinion. Our product's broken if we don't understand this is a complex ecosystem. We have to tune our product as an ecosystem, and because it's a service, we don't have to get it right away. We have to get it good enough to create the discovery, get it in the channel, and then we optimize it every single day to maximize the social impact, the learning impact, and the financial returns. And that takes a complex set of stakeholders. We are a double bottom line business. There was a bunch of sessions on social impact. And I've been running double bottom line, blended value businesses for quite a few years. And one thing, so this is a simple grid to look at. You know, a lot of businesses are up there, but the social impact businesses want both financial returns and social returns. What I've learned over the years, though, is it's very difficult to maximize both. There's just too much tension. So what we've done is, because we have a portfolio, we have some products where we're really dialing to maximize social impact, but in a sustainable way. Sometimes those happen with a philanthropic structure, sometimes they happen with a for-profit structure. You can solve those things. But we also have products where we're dialing for market-based returns, but with filters that align with our social impact goals. And we've had a lot more success with that one simple distinction in terms of our portfolio. Almost all of my gray hair is due to this slide, which is a core differentiator of our business is we are all about multi-stakeholder partnerships. What we do when you try to transform education, when you try to transform healthcare and refugee camps in Africa, a lot of the different projects we work on, cultural storytelling, which I'll talk about in a little bit, we need a lot of different domain skills. We need people from very different backgrounds. We need very different IP and financial structures. So these are all people we are actively working with, and many more. And mostly what I do during the day is not design a video game, or even not design a business model. A lot of my role is, how do I work with these stakeholders? How do our teams work with these stakeholders? How do we get in the same shoes? So that we're all trying to accomplish the same goal, leveraging our very different skills, backgrounds. What is the language? Where are we talking past each other? And this is a science. A lot of people know my brother who went here, who's become quite a well-known physicist. We have an older brother who actually specializes in decision-making in lateral systems with multi-stakeholder partnerships, the internet, large consortiums. These are things where nobody's in charge, but decisions have to be made. And it's a fascinating science, and it is a science. You can get better at it. This is a very high-level distinction. I mean, in some ways we're crazy. We're doing a lot of things that everybody would tell, including me, a startup, not to do, which is we are attacking both the consumer channel and the educational channel in parallel. We look at companies like Scholastic that will do Hunger Games and Harry Potter, but also Read 180 curriculum, Discovery with their cable channel, and Discovery Ed. And we kind of want to be that for games. We believe there's a lot of synergy. Kids are learning 24/7. Often we see great synergy between our education projects and our consumer products. But we tune them very differently. And in fact, we have two different studios, one in Seattle that does consumer, one in Phoenix that does education. We call our consumer line of business gateways because we don't test you on our consumer games. What we try to do is fire your imagination around a new idea, a new concept, something that you might not have thought before. Again, something like you might see in a Bob Dylan song, or I think in one of the sessions they were talking about participant media that's doing it in film. They've done everything from Good Night, Good Luck, Syriana, Inconvenient Truth. We want to do that with games. Our first big product is actually a joint venture with an Alaska Native tribal organization. Fascinating group called the Cook Inlet Tribal Council. Very, very different structure for the indigenous peoples of Alaska than the lower 48. And they were a pioneering social service organization that wanted to create a mission-aligned sustainable business. They wanted risk-adjusted, market-based returns. So they wanted to build a for-profit so they weren't dependent on government grants and other funding, but it had to be aligned with their mission and culture. They wanted to do it in a way that empowered their youth. And they had seen a speech that I had done at Games for Change or somewhere and kind of contacted me. And it's kind of a funny story because we're trying not to consult. We have 13, 14 projects around the world. We don't really have time to consult. And I tend to bring a lot of projects back, and my business partner, calls them the stray cats I bring in. I fall in love with all these projects. But I was so impressed with this group. I was preparing to call him and saying, we really should talk to these folks. And I said, they want us to come to Alaska. He said, stop right there, say yes. I'm like, why? You're the one who keeps telling me I've been to 49 states, I haven't been to Alaska. So I'm like, just say yes. But it's interesting. We flew into a blizzard. They wouldn't call it a blizzard. We flew into a blizzard. And we really hit it off with them. Flash forward 2 years later, they're our largest institutional investor. We're an investor in their organization. We've co-created the first indigenous-owned video game company. We have a joint venture, and we're married for life. You never know where these things will go. This is, our first project is on the premise of game-based cultural storytelling. We've looked at stories that have been around for thousands of years and said, why are these stories still there? What is it about these stories that have been passed down from one generation to another, helping to guide one generation, guiding another generation? A lot of folks, as Lisa mentioned, I was just at Davos, and I heard this from ministers of culture and heads of states around the world. People feel like their cultures are getting lost. Their youth are moving away from their elders. They're spending a lot of time on digital media. A lot of people blame video games. So we said, why can't video games be part of the solution? Can we bring world-class game makers with storytellers, find the verbs, find the themes, and build stories that build games that, for a global audience that serve as a gateway? So our creative director is a guy I hired at Activision in '94. He created a bunch of hits for us. He ran the Tomb Raider, which some of you may know as a multi-billion-dollar game franchise. This is a guy who's at the height of his craft. He has young girls. he's semi-retired, and he got excited about the project. So we're finding we can attract that level of talent. He's handpicked a team, an amazing Alaska Native elder storyteller that's holding her first console. But the young girl there, totally facile. This is up in Barrow on the Arctic slope. She's playing a demo of our game, and then she's cutting muktuk, which is the whale, for a meal that, a traditional meal. Talk about code shifting. So the project's called Never Alone, and I'll show you a quick video of it, just because I know this is abstract, to give you a little taste of what some of this stuff looks like. Oh, that didn't go to the video. Am I doing something wrong in terms of clicking on the video? It's very minimalist. It's kind of a black screen. But yeah, so we already have somebody who believes this will be a hit. I guess we look at the video. It's a shame because it's really beautiful. But I don't know, if somebody can tell me how to load the video, we'll load it. Otherwise, I'll just keep going. Two other projects we're doing in the space. We're working with USAID and the State Department on a civic engagement game in the Middle East, where we're taking a Facebook city building game, which is a very popular genre on Facebook. You build farms, you build cities. It's kind of a nurturing genre, and you do it socially. The way they make money, the commercial companies that do these games, is they charge microtransactions. So if you want to not have to get up at 2 in the morning, and believe it or not, people do it, to like to water your plants and you buy a tractor, well, that costs a couple bucks. If you want to get a vanity item, some cool thing that somebody else doesn't have, you pay a couple bucks. This is a multi-billion-dollar economy. For this project, we're doing a city building game, and to advance your city, you have to do real-world or online civic engagement, and that advances your city. So a very interesting theory of change. We're studying how games affect the brain, and we got a grant to study, it turns out violent first-person shooter games actually improve your learning and health in some very interesting ways. So we're studying if we can take out the violence and still get the neurological benefits. We're doing a middle school curriculum. This is in about 7,000 schools, and it's grown very quickly, that teaches kids how to design games to foster systems thinking, 21st century skills, critical thinking. We've had 10, 11, and 12-year-olds make about 500,000 games that have been played 15 million times in 100 countries, and these are 10 and 11-year-olds making complex games. We run a national video game competition that was announced by the president. 4 of our players have met the president at the National Science Fair. Minecraft, which is one of the most successful games on the planet, we have a partnership with a company called Teacher Gaming, where we're helping them bring this into the classroom. We're building curricular elements, teacher tools. I was going to show another video. We did a very interesting partnership with Google and Caltech, where we introduced quantum computing in Minecraft, which is kind of crazy for 12-year-olds. We had over 1 million downloads of kids actually exploring quantum mechanics in Minecraft. Very powerful. One of those kids might be the next great physicist, because the goal is to fire their imagination. You won't see the trailer. All our projects are all black. We're about 10,000 schools. We have no sales or marketing people. We focus on reducing friction for teacher adoption, showing early efficacy for both teachers and students, and teacher-to-teacher recommendations, because there's no better way for a teacher to select something than another teacher telling them it's good. And we've scaled to close to 10,000 schools, and we believe we're going to go much faster. So we're now expanding our portfolio. We think a lot about the dispositions. Am I almost at time? We're done. Okay, so that's our goal, is to help kids thrive in a rapidly changing and complex 21st century.
When the LACS planning team first began to discuss bringing SWAT talks to this year's conference, we wanted to make a connection between this gathering of entrepreneurs and the work being done here in the classroom, both to demonstrate the relationship between entrepreneurship and the liberal arts, and to give you an opportunity to hear from one of our stellar faculty members. And what better area of study could we choose than the relatively new field of behavioral economics? Aaron Bronchetti, who also researches public finance, labor economics, and health economics, has been a strong member of our campus community with numerous awards and publications. She's also been involved in community-based field experiments seeking to improve our broader community. So today she's going to speak with us about when is a nudge enough, using behavioral economics to understand and influence decision-making.
me. I'm not an entrepreneur. I don't know my talk as well as Alan seems to know his, so I will stay a little closer to the podium. But I appreciate being here, and I hope that what I have to say can at least spark a few ideas or be interesting to you. So an important question is, what is behavioral economics in comparison to standard economics? All of economics is in fact about behavior, so how is behavioral economics different? And what this field is doing is combining insights from economics and psychology to explore what's going to happen in markets in which some agents display human limitations and complications. So standard economic models, on the other hand, would assume quite a few things about human behavior that we may not think are exactly right. One being that people behave perfectly rationally. So what we mean by that is that people are objective, that they take in all available data when they're making decisions and updating their beliefs, that they can choose the best option among a whole host of options, and that their preferences over different options are stable, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. We also assume that they're motivated by self-interest, primarily by self-interest, if not entirely, that they display perfect self-control so they can implement the actions that they want to take without problems with follow-through and so on, and that they pay perfect attention. Behavioral economics, on the other hand, explores sort of two things. One is there evidence that those assumptions ought to be relaxed a little bit in these ways? And two, if we relax those assumptions, what happens in markets? What do our models then predict? So I'm going to give you direct examples of the first two, and I'm going to rely on your own introspection or view of the outside world to convince you that numbers 3 and number 4 probably need to be relaxed. So an example of a way in which people could violate perfect rationality is if they have time-inconsistent preferences. That is, preferences that change depending on the horizon that they're considering, the time horizon. And so we document this in experiments or surveys by asking them a whole series of questions about trade-offs they'd be willing to make. And this is a good example. So question 1 says, how much would you be willing to accept in 1 month to give up $15 today? And question 2 says, how much would you need in 10 years to give up $15 today? When you ask people this, well, the median answer to question 2 is about $100. And if you do a back-of-the-envelope calculation, that gives you an interest rate or a required rate of return of about 19%. Which sounds high, but not totally out of bounds. But if you ask them question number 1, the median answer is $20, suggesting that they need a 33% return over that 1 month. Or if we just multiply by 12 to get a good idea of the annual interest rate, they need a 400% interest rate to make that short-term trade-off. So what this suggests to us is that people may behave in a way that reveals that they are patient when they consider their long-run selves, but they're very impatient when they make short-term trade-offs. And that's going to be relevant for how we can influence their behavior. Another way in which preferences might not be stable is if they depend on the situation or context. And we call this reference-dependent preferences, or at least one model of this is reference dependence. The idea is that different alternatives are assessed based on whether they represent gains or losses compared to some reference point. Now you might be thinking, what do I mean by reference point, where there are multiple possibilities. It could be what you already have as your reference point, so the status quo. It could be what you would get if you did nothing as your reference point, or sort of an inertia argument. It could be that expectations are your reference point, or it could be that what other people around you have serve as a reference point. But the idea or the model that behavioral economists have in mind is this kind of model, where we can look at gains and losses on the horizontal axis, and we can look at the value or satisfaction that people receive on the vertical axis. And the fact that there's this inflection point, and this graph takes on this shape, tells us a couple of things. One, it tells us that if people truly have these kinds of preferences, they should dislike losses much more than they like gains of an equivalent size. And it should also tell us that people will be more willing to take risks over losses than they are over gains. So that's what we look for in the lab or in experiments to document whether people actually have preferences like this. So a good example of an experiment is where you divide people into 2 groups randomly. And group 1 is told, you've been given $1,000. Now you have to choose between A, a 50-50 gamble of receiving another $1,000, or receiving nothing, or B, receiving an additional $500 with certainty. Group 2 is told something slightly different. You've been given $2,000, and you have to decide between a 50-50 gamble of losing $1,000 or losing nothing, or losing $500 with certainty. Now notice that in all 4 outcomes, the expected value, or the probabilistic value, is $1,500. So what we're looking for, if we think loss aversion is really going on, or this reference dependence is going on, we're looking for group 2 to pick A a whole lot more than Group 1 does. And that's exactly what we see over and over again. Regardless of how we tweak these questions, we see a high rate of gambling over losses and a low rate over gains. So one more example of a way in which people could deviate from standard economic assumptions is that they could have bounded self-interest, altruistic motives, and so on. You can imagine that in this room in particular. And we measure this in the lab by playing something called the dictator game, which is a very, it's hardly even a game. The idea is you give player 1 $10, and you ask player 1, what would you like to give to player 2? What offer would you like to make him from 0 to 10? And player 2 is some anonymous person in another room. Right? And then player 2 keeps that offer, and player 1 keeps 10 minus X. Well, in a rational self-interested world, there's no reason for player 1 to give player 2 anything. He should, standard economics would say, keep all $10. But over and over again in these types of games, we see 60% of people giving something, which tells us that maybe people have altruistic motives, or maybe they have expectations for fairness or desires for fairness. You can also ask what happens on the other side. So what do people expect in terms of being treated fairly in markets? We play the ultimatum game then, which is just slightly different. Player 1 gets $10, and he's asked, how much do you want to give to player 2, this anonymous person in another room? And then player 2 now has some power. Player 2 can either accept whatever player 1 offers, in which case he gets that offer, and player 1 keeps 10 minus X, or he can reject it, in which case they both get nothing. Now, in a rational self-interest world, player 2, every time, should accept any offer of a penny or greater, because he does better that way than rejecting and getting nothing. But over and over again, we see that player 2s reject offers of nominal amounts, so 20% or less of what player 1 got, in this case $2. And that tells us a couple of things. It says people want to be treated fairly in these transactions, and if they're not, they're actually willing to punish the other player, even though that punishment makes them worse off. It's kind of a strong result, and it shows up time and time again in these experiments. So these findings have implications for behavior. Time and consistent preferences tells us that people are going to be impatient in the short run, patient in the long run. So they're going to be unwilling to make trades that involve a small cost now for some delayed future benefit. They may have problems with procrastination and self-control as well. Reference dependence or loss aversion tells us people may have a fundamental tendency to stick with the status quo and not deviate from that. It may also lead to endowment effects. That's where you believe that the value of an item that you own is greater than the value you'd place on it if you were a prospective buyer of that same item. This is why you should never price your own house if you're listing it on the market. You should let somebody else tell you what to list it at. Socially motivated preferences, as we just described, can tell us that altruism may be important and could be harnessed to influence behavior, and that people have a desire for fairness, and moreover that information about what others are contributing to charity or to the public good in general might be important. So now let's talk about a few well-known nudges and how they influence behavior. So one of the best-known tools in the arsenal of nudges is the default manipulation. That is, changing what would happen if an individual took no action. Most of the evidence on default effects come from the literature on 401k savings. And what they show, among other things, what they show is that when you switch to a system where you're automatically enrolled as an employee in a 401k versus a system where you have to opt in and voluntarily sign up, it increases participation by 50 percentage points, and that's a year later. Okay? And in the automatic enrollment, all you have to do to opt out is make a simple phone call. And yet we see these big and persistent effects on both participation and lifetime savings. But default effects hold up in other contexts as well. Here's organ donation consent rates across countries. The green are, as you might guess at this point, countries in which you have to opt out, and otherwise you're treated as an organ donor. The blue is countries where you have to actively opt in. The difference could be as small as checking or unchecking a box, and yet we see huge differences in participation rates. What else? Okay, so small incentives could have big effects on behavior. And the idea here is if there are trade-offs that people are unwilling to make that involve small costs now and delayed future benefits, then even just giving them a little bit of an incentive or a little bit of a current benefit might help. So the experiment I'm describing here is where economists tried to increase exercise. And they took a group of people and they randomly assigned them to 3 groups. There's a control group that gets absolutely nothing. Their health and their exercise behavior are just monitored. The first treatment group in the middle gets a small financial reward for showing up to the gym one time in the first week of the study. And then they're followed thereafter. The second treatment group, gets an additional financial reward if they show up to the gym 8 times within the first month of the study. Now the interesting thing about this is that the purple bar represents before any treatments are assigned. And the maroon bar represents not what happens during the study period, but what happens after the incentives are removed. So even after the incentive is removed, that group that was made to come 8 times to get their reward is still consistently doing more exercise, right? And this suggests that small incentives can even create habit formation, or positive effects that persist after the incentive is removed. Good, so we could also try making the future self more salient. This is one of my favorite examples. They took a group of people and randomly divided them into a control and treatment. And then they asked them, how much of your current salary would you like to contribute to retirement savings, from 0 to 10%? The control group was shown a picture of their current self. The treatment group was shown a picture of their age-progressed self. The treatment group saved statistically significantly more. They saved 6% compared to 4%, just based on that incredibly low-cost nudge of seeing the age-progressed picture of themselves. We could try to harness loss aversion, and this has been shown to be impactful in productivity bonuses. Okay? If people dislike losses more than they like equivalent-sized gains, then if we tell workers, hey, you have this bonus, as long as you make this certain productivity target, it's yours to lose, versus telling them, you could get this bonus if you make this productivity target, it's yours to gain, we should see bigger impacts on productivity. And we see that whether we're studying Chicago school teachers and their students' test scores, or whether we're studying Chinese factory workers. Loss aversion can also be harnessed to change behavior through voluntary commitment contracts. So this is what Stick.com, a website started by behavioral economists, is doing. People publicly commit to a goal on Stick.com, and they put down a certain amount of their own money, and then unless they meet that goal, as verified by a third party, they lose the money. You see $17 million are on the line. If you read the testimonials, the effects on behavior, like quitting smoking or weight loss and so on, are very, very impressive. Social motives and peer influence. This is my last nudge I'll talk about for now. Many of us have gotten an energy bill, an electricity bill, where we see our own consumption last month, and then we see our neighbors, and then maybe we even see our most efficient neighbors, which is the green bar up there. The reason we get those bills is because in 2004, social scientists went out and did a field experiment in San Diego, and they randomly assigned households to one of 4 groups, and they put flyers on their doorknobs. Group 1 was told, conserve energy to protect the environment. Group 2 is told, conserve energy so you can save money. Group 3 is told, conserve energy to save the planet for future generations. And Group 4 is told, your neighbors are already taking actions to conserve energy. The only one that works is Group 4. Okay. Good, I'm doing okay on time. So there's more work to be done, and I'm going to talk about a few things that I think should be done in this area, and they're mostly informed by my own work and sort of work with colleagues at Swarthmore and what's going on with those projects. So one is that we need to know more about the underlying mechanisms that cause some of these nudges, like the defaults, to have big impacts. With the default effects, we don't really know whether it's loss aversion, or whether it's time inconsistency, or what it is exactly. It's a bit of a black box, and if we knew more, we'd be better able to design nudges that will work in all populations. And then the other question, or the other thing I think we need to worry about is, well, do nudges only work when the nudged behavior is roughly in line with what the individual wants to do or thinks he ought to do anyway? Both of those concerns come from a project I did a couple of years ago with colleagues in the econ department. We went into low-income tax assistance sites. We were dealing with low-income filers, and we were trying to use that same 401k nudge, where they were going to be automatically enrolled in a savings program with their refund if they were in the treatment group, and otherwise they'd get the chance to opt in if they were in the control group. We didn't see the same result with the 401k product. We saw, in fact, that they participated at exactly the same rate, which tells you that the folks in the treatment group actively opted out over and over again. And there could be multiple explanations for that. It could be, for instance, that low-income tax filers are just in a very different situation than 401k holders are, and that they have pre-existing intentions to spend their refunds on paying down credit card bills or buying a new washer and dryer or whatever it might be. So that a nudge is not a shove. You can't move someone away from a behavior toward a behavior that's suboptimal for them. If they know that what they need to do is pay down credit card bills, they'll opt out of your nudge. Maybe that's what's going on. Another thing I think we need to work on is understanding more about the underlying decision-making that leads to the undesirable undesirable behavior in the first place. And if we know more about that, then we can design nudges that will be impactful. They'll tell us how to design the nudges. And that comes from work that I've done, again, with econ colleagues on trying to encourage preventive health behavior, in this case, flu vaccination. We ran an email campaign across 6 campuses. We had 2 goals. One was to understand the behavior. How much of the fact that students didn't get flu vaccines came from the fact that they were uninformed or inattentive, that they had preferences against the vaccine, or that they just failed to follow through even though they wanted to get a vaccine. And then secondly, let's test 3 different interventions by email that might cause them to get more vaccine. 1 being a financial reward, 2 being a message of peer endorsement for the vaccine, and 3 being a salience treatment, in this case, an audio clip of a sick person coughing. So in terms of their behavior, what we see is the barriers are significant at every single stage. So they open emails at a fairly high rate, about 70%. And 2/3 of people read those emails. It suggests maybe attention isn't the whole story. People do seem to be paying some attention. But among those who are arguably fully informed, only about half indicate that they intend to get the vaccine. So preferences are a big part of the story. And lastly, among those who intend to get the vaccine, tell us that, only 27% actually follow through. That's a big impact, a follow through, a big result. And that graph tells us a little bit about, let's go back, why the incentive was the only one to work. Because a financial incentive will address all of those barriers that cause drop-off at every single stage. Whereas the low-cost nudges, the salience and the peer endorsement nudge, weren't quite as powerful against some of those barriers. And that leads me to sort of my concluding remarks. I've shown you a lot of evidence that even small nudges can impact behavior. But there's uncertainty about the size of the effects. They're not all as big as the 401k savings example. Part of the problem, I think, with the growing popularity of nudges is it's tempting to do nudges because they're low cost. So even if they have small effects, well, they didn't cost us that much. But going with nudges all the time or being so tempted to think about nudges takes us a little bit away from more difficult policy conversations. And the quote I have in mind is from David Cameron, who's a big fan of behavioral economics. And he said, you know, the best way to get people to reduce energy consumption is to show them what their neighbors are doing. Even behavioral economists would probably say no. The best way to get them to reduce energy consumption is to change the price, to tax them. Okay? But that's a much more difficult policy discussion to have. So I think I'd just leave you with that caveat, that nudges are very, very popular, but they're popular for a reason, which is that they're low cost. It may not always be the case that they have big impacts. Thank you.
If you know nothing else about Orbis International, you may have heard of its Flying Eye Hospital. This is an ophthalmic hospital located on board a DC-10 jet. Volunteer pilots fly the jet and an international medical team to developing countries around the world to teach urgently needed sight-saving skills. This is only one of the projects of this pioneering organization, of which Jenny Hurahan Malin became CEO and president in 2012. Jenny brings to Orbis a strong background in finance, management, and international development through her prior work at ProMujer International, Bank of America, and other investment firms. Today, she's here to talk with us about creating roadmaps to success. Will someone's life be better because you were here? Setting a big, hairy, audacious goal and using it to work towards success. Thanks, Jenny.
Can you hear me? This is working fine? Great. Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And that's such an overweening, self-congratulatory title, setting a big, hairy, ambitious goal. And I have Alex Unger to blame for that. Because my talk today is really about a process of deciding how to accomplish something, which sounds a little dry. So I said to Alex, gosh, do you think people really want to hear about a process as opposed to games and this fascinating economic behavior? And so we decided to try that silly title and nudge you or deceive you into listening. So yes, Orbis is a 30-year-old organization devoted to eliminating blindness by creating quality eye care enduring quality capacity to deliver eye care to people in developing countries. We have a budget of about $45 million. We operate in 9 developing countries. The airplane is the most visible, emotional, heart-throbbing part of what we do, but only actually a small part of what we do. The vast majority of what we do is invest in principally training of human resources, the entire cadre of human resources you need to deliver quality eye care. Nurses, doctors, technicians, community health workers, people who fix equipment, the whole range, because no one part can succeed alone. And it's very interesting, when I first became involved in blindness, I really had no prior experience, and I thought, why this? But actually, this particular specific tangible intervention has an enormous impact on the world, because it's probably one of the most cost-effective medical interventions you can make. When you restore someone's sight, they go back to work the next day. And someone who is in their 50s and blind and dependent on their family can go right back to their field and farm. Or a child can go to school and demonstrably do better in school and learn more. Or a woman who is impaired can become marriageable when she's otherwise not in her society. So there's an enormous effect on a very wide range of people, an entire community, from something very specific and tangible, and that's why this is so appealing. And it's also appealing because you're investing in the capacity of people. We don't provide services, we train people to provide services. That's where I end the advertisement. But the reason that I became introduced to theory of change, and I'd only done this once, is because we're doing a strategic plan. And theory of change is really a fascinating methodology I just became aware of. It's very, very broadly used, not only in nonprofits, but also in businesses. So I thought it was really relevant to the people putting together the entrepreneurial business plans today. And in fact, I think if some of them used this, they would be able to address some of the issues we saw in the business cases they presented to us, pieces they were missing along the way and hadn't thought about. So theory of change is a very popular methodology. Go. Or this right there. And we're going to cover today what is theory of change, the structure and components of a theory of change map, what is the scope of making that map, an example of how we've used it at Orbis, keys to success, and if we have time, questions. A theory of change is not a strategic plan and it is not a business plan. It is simply a framework that forces you to put down all your assumptions and all the things you think need to happen to accomplish a goal. So, it's a causal framework. How and why a change process will happen in a particular context. In the case of Orbis, what we want to accomplish, what we set out as our goal, is quality eye care for all. Now that's not a goal we can deliver by ourselves. And it's not the point of the theory of change to say exactly what you need to do. The point is to lay out all of the things that have to happen to get to a goal, and then identify what pieces you are going to execute. That becomes the basis for a business plan. So theory of change, which sounds very simple, is actually hard to do, and you have to be quite rigorous because it reverses the usual process in which people do things. They say, I'd like to sell a widget, and they say, okay, I'm going to find somebody to make the widget, and I'm going to find somebody to sell it. We don't do that. Theory of change says, I want 20% of the market for games to own X kind of game. What do I have to do to accomplish that? What are all the things I think have to happen to reach that goal? And it asks you to be very specific about that goal. Then, based on that outcomes framework, you identify your interventions and activities. And you build indicators to know if you're successful. It's very important to have an indicator, 20% of the market, within 12 months. Be very specific about when you want to accomplish something by a particular date. And then really challenge yourself to make explicit all of your assumptions and to identify the rationale for your preconditions. I'll come to an example soon. So it's both a process and a product, and it's very invigorating to go through, and it's necessary to do in a group. You could do it by yourself, but it's much more challenging and fun when you're with other people. So how can you use theory of change? It's a roadmap of outcomes, how to get where you want to go. It's the basis of agreement. It's a collaborative exercise so that everybody, forced to define their assumptions and defend them, agree on a map at the end. And it changes all the time, by the way. It's not a static thing. You could re-examine your assumptions over and over again. It demonstrates impact in a real way by identifying metrics. It's a framework for implementation, and it's a basis for monitoring and evaluation, which is sort of nonprofit speak, but you could in the for-profit world say it's a basis for measuring success through ROIs or profit margins or whatever you chose as your indicator. Did I get that? Here are the components. So we start with outcomes and preconditions that are modeled in causable pathways. We're going backwards. If I want this outcome, this has to exist. Someone has to do this. Then you lay out your assumptions. You examine and explicitly explain your rationales for those assumptions. I think this is true because of X. And what your indicators are, and then you identify your own interventions and activities. And finally, it's usually helpful to write a narrative, to put it on paper and say whether it sounds logical. That would be a business plan that we saw today, for example. Okay, so this is just another way to put this. You have an ultimate outcome, a long-term outcome, and then, with rationales, preconditions you think have to exist before you get to that outcome. This dotted line is actually kind of interesting. It's what they call in theory of change a ceiling of accountability. You might not be able to achieve the outcome all by yourself. Quality eye care for all. We can't make that happen in the world of Orbis. But we can choose certain long-term outcomes, like the requisite number of doctors who provide eye care exist in a country, and that would be something we can accomplish. And then there might be other factors we don't think we can influence, and that might allow us to establish. So it's very important to know where in this map does your intervention or your activity ultimately have an impact, and how far you can get. There are three things about assumptions that are important. There are assumptions about causality, what leads to what to bring about change. There are assumptions about implementation. Can you execute the way you think you can? And there are assumptions about external factors, conditions that will influence your ability to affect, things you may or may not be able to change. And it's really important to divide those. So assumptions about how something happens, assumptions about what you do, and therefore what your behavior you could change, and assumptions about how others behave that you may or may not be able to change. I mean, here's an example. Battery-powered cars need charging stations. Who's going to create those, and do you have to do so? So you might be Tesla, and you might have as a goal, 25% of the population will be driving an electric car in 20 years. That could be your goal. That could be your big, hairy goal. What has to change if that can happen? You might say to yourself, there have to be charging stations all over the city, like a gas station. Somebody might come to you and say, and challenge that assumption. They say, really? Or do you need to build a car that everybody can just plug in at home? Or do you have to have charging stations all over the city? Is it good enough to just have them in one city? Or people can't drive from place to another? They actually have to exist in a geographic region. So you have to examine all those assumptions and see what is that precondition that has to exist for people to actually use cars, not just you make them, and who can make that happen? And defend why you think that's the case. So assumptions are beliefs about conditions that you think already exist and are not problematic in many cases, and they're also critical to the validity. As you develop assumptions, it's very helpful to keep track of what are your assumptions and what are your preconditions. Assumptions are things you think exist. Preconditions are things you think have to happen before the outcome can be achieved. Measurable indicators of success or evidence, which is an important part of a successful map, I think I've really touched on. Here I give an example of small-scale farmers have access to capital, and you might make an indicator for yourself such as, what is the proportion of farmers that obtain a business loan? In a year, half of all eligible farmers should have gotten a loan, and now you have something by which to measure your success or achievement. So I'm just walking through these assumptions. So for every indicator, what you need is, you need a what you want to have happen. You need a to who is doing that, or who is receiving it. You need how many. You need a real metric for what the degree of success, what degree is success, and that could change over time. It could be small in the beginning and it could ramp up over time. You need how good in this map, which is basically whether the service actually achieves your goal of you want farmers, why do you want farmers to get business loans? So they can plant more crops, so they can be more profitable. Well, the loans themselves have to be attractive. They can't be usurious. And you need a time frame. Your actions. These are your actions or activities that are going to achieve particular outcomes. Interventions follow outcomes. I want people to access eye health. Your intervention is I'm going to train doctors who can deliver eye health, just as an example. And that helps you focus on what has to be done and who is the best person to do it. And you can put interventions anywhere on the map. I'm going to, rationale I think we probably all understand in this room, and I've talked about it quite a bit. Why do you think that has to be true? But I'd like to get to the process. So just so you can see just how messy this is, this is really great. When we began our theory of change map, we had 40 people in a room. We divided up into 4 groups of 10. We had just the outcome, quality eye care for all. And then every group had to develop their own map and work back. And so it looks really, really messy in the beginning. It's a lot of Post-its. Actually, there was a surprising amount of consistency when people did this, but it did go through a lot of iterations and a lot of slips of paper being torn into small pieces and moved around and debate about where things belonged. We eventually got to our first theory of change map, and you can see here what this looks like for Orbis. You can't read it, but the yellow boxes are high quality eye care exists. So that is, there are doctors who are trained, there are nurses who are trained, there's a clinic to go to. You have supplies. The supplies are priced at a point, well, actually that goes into a different box. If supplies exist, a supply chain exists so that the consumables necessary for the service get to the clinic where they're going to be. So you walk back through all of those boxes, which I'm sorry you can't read, but I really wanted to show you here the evolution. The green is effective partnerships, because we were focused on local capacity. So that was, you have a partner with leadership and integrity and ethics who can execute with you, for example. The blue is services are accessed by all. It's not enough that it exists. Someone has to go and consume it. And just as we see here that the absolute existence of services doesn't mean people take them up, in this case, that causal pathway was, how do you identify people who need eye care? How do you create a referral pathway? How does the person get from the place they are to the place of treatment? Access, financial access is hugely important and always an issue in all health systems. Who is going to pay for what? Sometimes a person pays directly. More often than not, payment for health services is some kind of transfer payment, called many different things, called insurance, called National Health Service, called free public health system, which is a misnomer. It's some method of transferring money that enables the whole group, not just one group, to get services. And the red bar, the red box was health policy. I'll give you an example. Optometry was not a recognized profession in Ethiopia until we advocated for it to be so. So you actually have to have the existence of a profession that's licensed and allowed, or you can't have a body of people who provide high-quality spectacles. So you have to have the government on your side in that case. So you have to work back along all these. And I just want to show you how this changed. Oh, there's the yellow bar, just to give you a sense of, you know, the boxes that are filled out. Workforce, trained workforce, you have to recruit people, they have to have continuing education, you have to have capacity to deliver education. Health schools, or medical schools, for example. This is the advocacy one. Evidence, can't convince people to do things usually unless you can prove to them it's worthwhile. And there we have, that's one box. I'll go through them real quick. You can see how they changed around. There we went to a whole different, more parallel, more things happening in parallel as opposed to sequentially. We changed our mind. Then when we went to this box, we said, well, we can influence all the things on the top. The ones on the bottom are not causal to the ones on the top. They're things that are enablers. We debated this a lot and went through a lot of versions, and we finally ended up with version 4, in which the first pink box, which wasn't there at all in the beginning, was what kind of eye problems are there? So simply measuring what sorts of things you actually need to address. So I'm going to conclude simply by saying that this is a really interesting way in business or in social endeavors to try to be rigorous about all the things you need to solve to get to the end, and then pick out the things you're doing and understand the barriers to success. And the keys to success are having the right group of people together, so you have all the views that you need, understanding why you're doing it, what is it you want to accomplish, doing the necessary pre-work. Is there evidence you need to study? Are there examples you should look at? Having an open mind and being willing to change your mind a lot as you go through it. Having time to think, because it just doesn't happen that quickly. Having self-awareness of your own views and assumptions and others who can challenge those. And then lastly, not getting bogged down. You really iterate and iterate. It's kind of uncomfortable. It's very, very messy. It's a lot of fun, actually, and it gets easier with practice. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, I'm Nancy Burkett. I'm the Director of Career Services. I just want to thank our wonderful SWOT Talk presenters. Alan, Erin, and Jenny, you were our guinea pigs. This is the first time we've tried this format of the conference, and I think after your feedback that you all will share with us and our debriefing, I think it's really something that I would love to see move forward in the future. It's been really wonderful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and ideas. I would like to also thank, of course, the Lax family for their support in generating this conference, the idea and the concept of this conference, and funding it, and for their just continued support over the years in helping us think creatively about entrepreneurship as a college and as a community. I'd like to also thank Joe Turner, who did a wonderful conference opener for us. Thank you, Joe, and also served. Joe also served double duty, as did Jenny and Eric, as our SWOT team judges, and we appreciate your work very much. We'd also like to thank our discussion group leaders, our SWOT teams, the Idea Stall presenters, Shalom Sar, who we've already acknowledged, but please, again, I think we must acknowledge his wonderful leadership and as the moderator of the SWOT team. Shalom. I'd also like to acknowledge a couple of people who haven't been acknowledged so far, and I have the great fortune to work with them every day. Erin Massey and Jennifer Barrington in Career Services were great mentors to the SWOT teams. They met with the Entrepreneurship Club every week throughout the year to make this happen, and thank you so much for your hard work. And finally, I wanted to thank the staffs of Career Services, Alumni Relations and Development. Many of you know us already, but we do meet throughout the year to plan this conference. We welcome your suggestions, your feedback. I think soon, if not already, you will have received an evaluation for the conference. We really do take into account your feedback, and each year we make changes to this conference based on that feedback. So thank you for sharing that with us. And finally, I just want to thank all of you for attending, for your commitment, for your energy, for the great conversations, the great feedback you've given the student teams and the discussion groups. And let's continue the conversation out in the lobby at our reception. So thank you all.